How do you survive a blizzard in the middle of a vast plain, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest tree? The romantic image of the Wild West is one of sun-scorched deserts and midday duels, but its true test was the cold. Settlers moving westward with axes at the ready were confronted with a shocking reality. Their main tool was useless where there was no firewood. This harsh truth forced an entire generation to invent new ways to simply survive until spring. Watch the video to the end to find out how an ordinary fieldstone became a safe battery for a bed, what was hidden behind the mysterious term coal night light, and why earthen houses, despite their simplicity, saved thousands of lives, proving that true engineering is born not out of luxury, but out of desperation. What if I told you that everything you believed about the conquest of the Wild West was untrue? The pioneers' real enemy was not a bandit with a revolver, but the silent, pervasive cold. The image of the steadfast woodcutter building a log cabin remained in the forests of Ohio and Kentucky. The Great Plains greeted settlers with a completely different landscape, an ocean of grass stretching from horizon to horizon. This world lacked the main building and heating resource that humanity had used for millennia. Families arriving in Kansas, Nebraska, or Dakota experienced a real psychological shock. They brought with them tools and skills that were ideal for the wooded East. Their heavy axes, saws, and wedges were virtually useless in a world where the tallest plant was no higher than a person's waist. The initial plan to build a sturdy log house and stock up on firewood for the winter fell apart in the first few days. The first winter on the plains became a harsh lesson in survival. The settlers faced blizzards that could last for weeks and temperatures that dropped to extremely low levels. The wind, encountering no obstacles in its path, blew the heat out of any temporary shelters. The lack of firewood meant not just discomfort, but a direct threat to the family's existence. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about the clash between expectations and reality that the pioneers faced? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our stories about survival on the frontier. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the homes of the first pioneers really smelled like? The first and most obvious solution to the fuel shortage was a resource that covered the plains in abundance. We are talking about dried bison dung, which settlers called bison chips, or, using a word more familiar to us, kizyak. As long as millions of bison roamed the prairies, this resource was virtually inexhaustible. Collecting this fuel was a laborious and not particularly pleasant task, which fell mainly to women. They would go out onto the prairie with baskets or wheelbarrows and collect the sun-dried patties. It was a daily routine, vital for the survival of the family. Preparing dung for the winter was as important a task as gathering firewood was for farmers in the East. The collected chips were neatly stacked near the house in large piles resembling haystacks. These piles were carefully covered from the rain as wet fuel became useless. The size of such a dung woodpile was an indicator of the family's foresight and security for the coming winter. Contrary to popular belief, well-dried bison dung had almost no unpleasant odor when burned. It gave off a grassy, slightly spicy aroma, similar to that of burning dry grass. This smell became an integral part of everyday life in the first sod houses on the plains. Such dung burned very quickly and hotly, but did not produce coals. This meant that the stove required constant attention. One of the family members had to stay by the hearth, throwing new portions of fuel into the firebox. The fire could not be left unattended for even an hour. What is it like to build your entire daily life around such an unusual and labor-intensive resource? In the next chapter, we will reveal a secret that has been passed down from generation to generation. How engineers and farmers tried to make fire burn on ordinary grass. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the engineers of the Wild West, born of pure desperation. When the bison herds disappeared and their own herds of cows were not yet large enough, the settlers turned to the only inexhaustible resource they had at their feet: grass. But how do you make something burn that burns in a second? This problem gave rise to an entire industry of unique and now forgotten devices. The problem with grass and hay was obvious. They had extremely low density. A typical armful of hay thrown into the furnace produced only a bright flash and a handful of ashes. It could not provide the sustained heat needed to heat a house or cook food. A way to compact this material was needed. The solution was simple, but incredibly labor-intensive. Throughout the winter, families spent long evenings twisting hay. They took bundles of dry grass and twisted them tightly into dense bundles resembling logs. These grass logs could now be used in the stove, where they burned longer and provided more heat. This monotonous work brought the whole family together. From sunset until late at night, people sat by the fire, methodically twisting bundle after bundle. It was as important as spinning wool or repairing harnesses. A supply of these grass logs was vital, but self-taught engineers went further. They realized that even twisted hay burned too quickly. This led to the creation of hay burners, special stoves designed exclusively for this type of fuel. These were amazing and sometimes dangerous devices. Most of these stoves were simple metal drums with a pipe, but they had one key feature: a fuel feed mechanism. Often it was a special hopper or pipe, which was tightly packed with hay. Using a piston or screw mechanism, the hay was slowly and meticulously fed into the firebox. This allowed the combustion to be controlled. Only as much hay as could be effectively burned at that moment was fed into the furnace. Such furnaces required constant supervision. It was necessary to continuously turn the mechanism, feeding in new portions of fuel. It was a job that never stopped, day or night. The heat from such stoves was intense but unstable. The thin metal walls glowed red hot, posing a serious fire hazard in a cramped sod house. Families lived in constant tension, fearing that a single spark could destroy their home and supplies. This incredible adaptation shows the true spirit of the frontier. If you appreciate such ingenuity, which made fire serve man even in the most hopeless conditions, support our channel with a like. What if I told you that your house is your main stove? On the frontier, this was not a metaphor. In a world where every log and every bundle of dry grass was precious, a house really had to not only protect from the wind, but also function as a giant heat accumulator. Getting heat was only half the battle. The real art was in keeping that heat in. That's why the pioneers, without knowing it, became the first creators of energy-efficient housing, long before the term energy efficiency even existed. On the endless plains, where the horizon stretched endlessly, and there was not a single tree, the pioneers faced a fundamental problem: what to build with. The forests were far away, and transporting lumber across the prairie was expensive. But the ground beneath their feet was literally alive, dense, bound together by thousands of roots. It became the main building material. The top layer of soil, densely interwoven with turf, proved to be so strong that it could be cut into whole blocks. These bricks, pieces of turf half a meter long, 30 centimeters wide, and as thick as a human palm, became the foundation of the future house. The construction process was slow and difficult. First, a location was chosen, usually on a small hill so that meltwater would not flood the dwelling in the spring. Then a special plow was used to cut strips of turf, which were chopped into blocks. Each block weighed several kilograms. They were carefully stacked on top of each other, grass side down, so that the roots would intertwine and bind the structure together. The walls were made in 2 rows with offset joints, as in brickwork. A small gap was left between the rows, which was filled with dry earth, an additional insulating layer. The walls were up to a meter thick. It was not just a barrier, but a living organism. The earthen walls had enormous thermal inertia. They heated up slowly during the day and cooled down just as slowly at night. In winter, when the fire in the stove died down, the walls began to give off the heat accumulated during the day, like a huge body pulsating with residual heat. It was this property that made a turf house such a reliable shelter. Sod houses, or soddies as they were called, had another huge advantage. They were airtight. The wind, which never stopped blowing on the prairie, found no cracks to blow through, as it did in log cabins. No boards creaked, no walls shook. Inside, there was an amazing silence, and even when a blizzard raged outside, you could talk quietly in the house. The arrival of the railroad was a turning point in the battle for warmth on the Great Plains. The rails stretching across the continent carried not only new settlers and goods. Their cars carried something that the prairies sorely lacked: an efficient, concentrated fuel. That fuel was coal. For settlers tired of endlessly gathering dung and twisting hay, coal seemed like a real black diamond. One bag of coal could provide as much heat as a whole cartload of dung. It burned long and hot and provided stable heat, allowing people not just to survive, but to live in comfort. Of course, this comfort came at a price. Coal had to be purchased at railway stations, and it was expensive. For many families, fuel became one of the largest items of expenditure in their annual budget. Farmers had to travel tens of kilometers to the nearest station to load their carts with coal for the winter. Where coal seams were close to the surface, small local mines sprang up. Settlers mined so-called bank coal themselves, simply digging it out of hillsides or riverbanks. It was dangerous, but it allowed them to obtain fuel for free, risking only their own strength. The advent of coal also required new stoves. The old tin hay burners were not designed for the high heat that coal produced. They were replaced by massive cast iron stoves capable of withstanding high temperatures and distributing heat efficiently. It was then that the so-called coal nightlights appeared, which we mentioned at the beginning. These were small but very efficient stoves, often cylindrical in shape. Their design was intended for slow, almost smoldering combustion of coal throughout the night. The secret was in the controlled air supply. Special dampers and blowers allowed the intensity of combustion to be precisely regulated. At night, the stove was tightly loaded with coal, and the air supply was reduced to a minimum. The coal did not burn, but smoldered, giving off even heat. The transition to coal marked the end of the era of pioneer survival and the beginning of an era of settled, civilized life on the plains. It freed up time that had previously been spent gathering fuel for other, more productive activities. The struggle for warmth ceased to be a moment-to-moment concern and became a planned purchase of resources. Guess which object underfoot became the main heat accumulator of the 19th century? Even with the advent of efficient coal stoves, heating in frontier homes was local. As a rule, only one room was heated, the common living room or kitchen where the stove stood. Bedrooms remained freezing. In such conditions, going to sleep became a real challenge. Bedding in an unheated room was not just cold, it was icy and damp. Lying down in such a bed meant a serious shock to the body. To solve this problem, the pioneers used an ancient and incredibly effective method: heat accumulators. The simplest and most affordable accumulator was an ordinary stone. Families picked up smooth, flat field stones or bricks and used them to transfer heat. Steatite, or soapstone, was considered the ideal material for this purpose. This mineral has unique heat capacity. It heats up slowly and releases heat very slowly. Specially carved steatite hot water bottles were a valuable item in the household and were passed down from generation to generation. If steatite was not available, any dense stone without cracks or ordinary red brick would do. The main thing was that it could withstand heating and did not crack. These stones and bricks were kept by the hearth or directly on the stove all day long. In the evening, when the stones were as hot as possible, the ritual of preparing for bed began. The hot stone or brick was taken out of the stove using tongs or rags. It was too hot to be picked up with bare hands. Then this improvised battery was wrapped in several layers of thick fabric. Old flannel, burlap, or unwanted pieces of blanket were used for this purpose. This was necessary to avoid burns and to slow down the release of heat. The stone, wrapped in this way, was placed in bed half an hour before bedtime. It slowly warmed the sheets and blankets, creating a warm and cozy cocoon in the bed. By the time a person went to bed, they were greeted not by an icy bed, but by a pleasant, dry warmth. The same stone remained at the feet all night, continuing to give off heat and warm the sleeper. It was, in essence, the first electric blanket that worked without electricity. Sometimes such stones were taken along in a wagon when going on a winter trip to warm the feet on the road. What household item would you use for warmth if there were no electricity or central heating? In the next chapter, we'll talk about how pioneers built stoves that worked like huge brick batteries, retaining heat for days. While many settlers used simple and inefficient American fireplaces that threw most of the heat up the chimney, immigrants from Europe brought different technologies with them. German, Scandinavian, and Russian immigrants knew the secret to truly efficient heating. That secret was thermal mass, embodied in a massive brick stove. Instead of constantly burning fuel to maintain heat, they built a stove that worked on the principle of a battery. It was not just a firebox with a chimney, but a complex engineering structure in the center of the house. Such a stove, often called a mason heater or a stone stove, was the heart of the entire dwelling. The design of such a stove was ingenious. It consisted of a firebox and a complex winding system of smoke channels running inside a huge mass of brick or stone. Before exiting the chimney, the hot gases had to travel a long way inside this mass. The combustion process was short but very intense. Fuel, whether wood, coal, or even twisted hay, was placed in the stove and burned very quickly at a high temperature. This ensured complete combustion of the fuel and maximum heat release. The hot flue gases, passing through the internal labyrinths, gave off almost all their heat to the surrounding bricks. As a result, the chimney itself was barely warm at the outlet, which testified to the incredible efficiency of the system. All the heat remained inside the house and did not escape outside. After the fuel burned out, the dampers were tightly closed. The huge mass of bricks heated from the inside began to slowly and evenly radiate a soft, pleasant warmth. This heat did not dry the air or create drafts as a hot metal stove would. Creating heat was an important task, but not the only one. Equally important was the battle to preserve it. The most insidious enemy in this battle was the draft. The incessant wind of the Great Plains found the slightest crack in the structure of the house and blew out the precious heat. Fighting drafts was a daily routine. Even in relatively airtight sod houses, the joints between the roof and walls, as well as window and door openings, were weak spots. These gaps required constant attention and caulking. Anything that could stop the wind was used. The spaces between the logs in wooden houses or the gaps in sod houses were filled with a mixture of clay, moss, and dry grass. This work was never-ending. As the house dried out and settled, new cracks appeared, which had to be filled immediately. Windows were a particular problem. Glass was expensive and let in the cold. Therefore, the windows in the pioneers' houses were made very small. At night, they were closed not only with wooden shutters, but also hung with heavy blankets or old carpets from the inside to create an additional thermal barrier. Newspapers were an invaluable insulating material. They were not only used to cover the walls from the inside, creating a primitive barrier against wind and moisture. Newspaper sheets were rolled into thick rolls and used to plug gaps in window frames. A layer of old newspapers under the carpet on the floor could significantly reduce heat loss. When the external environment is hostile and heating is inadequate, the last line of defense is clothing. On the frontier, it was not just part of the wardrobe, but a tool for survival. The pioneers understood perfectly well that heating the entire house was a luxury that those living in the steppe, where fuel had to be obtained, dried, and conserved, could not afford. It was much more practical to warm the person rather than the air. Each layer of clothing became a small stove that retained body heat. Wool was the basis of the winter wardrobe. This material was a true miracle of nature and a faithful ally of man, in the fight against the cold. Wool had a unique property. It kept you warm even when wet. Wool fibers trapped air inside and created a layer that insulated the body from the outside environment. Cotton, on the other hand, lost all its heat-insulating qualities when wet and turned into a trap for the cold. Therefore, wool, whether sheep, goat, or even dog, was not just a preference but a matter of life and death. Settlers quickly realized that the secret to warmth lay not in one thick layer of clothing, but in many thin layers. They wore shirts, vests, and flannel overalls, topped with woolen jackets and capes. This principle of layering, which is well known to tourists and mountaineers today, was simply an intuitive rule of survival for them. Each layer trapped a little air, and air, unlike fabric, was the best insulator. The more layers, the warmer it was, and at the same time, it was easier to regulate the temperature by removing or adding clothing. The famous Union suit, a one-piece wool or flannel jumpsuit, held a special place. It covered the entire body, from the neck to the ankles, and fastened with buttons at the front, while the back had a distinctive door for convenience. This garment was so practical that it was worn continuously throughout the winter. Some jokingly said that it was only taken off in the summer to be washed and put back on again. Despite this, the jumpsuit was incredibly effective. It retained body heat and protected against drafts, even in houses that were frozen to the bone. No one went lightly dressed inside the house. Even when near the stove, men did not take off their woolen vests, and women did not take off their thick shawls. The heat, obtained with such difficulty, could not be lost. Women wore 2 or 3 petticoats, each of which created an additional layer of air. Men preferred coarse cloth trousers and thick socks, sometimes knitted from sheep's wool by hand. Even children knew their winter rules. They were taught not to run around the house barefoot, not to take off their mittens unnecessarily, and not to leave their heads uncovered. After all, most of a person's body heat is lost through the head, a fact later confirmed by science, but known to people since time immemorial. Therefore, even indoors, children and adults often wore knitted hats, hoods, or nightcaps. Heating was concentrated in one part of the dwelling, the so-called core. This was usually the kitchen, combined with the living room. This is where the stove stood, food was prepared, and the whole family gathered. The chimney passing through the ceiling heated the beams and warmed the attic a little, but the other rooms remained cold. This central hearth was the heart of the home. All life revolved around it. Tools were repaired, clothes were mended, children were taught, and stories were told here. There was another aspect of winter survival that is often overlooked when talking about heating and warmth. It was the struggle for water, for the very possibility of having liquid water in the house. In conditions where the temperature inside the home fluctuated around freezing, keeping water in liquid form became a task no less vital than keeping the fire burning in the hearth. Without water, it was impossible to cook food, wash, or water livestock. It was an integral part of the daily struggle for life. It was especially difficult during this period with foods that contained moisture. Potatoes, cabbage, carrots. All of these had to be stored so that they would not freeze. Frozen vegetables lost their taste and spoiled quickly. And due to limited space in the house, they had to be kept either in bags by the stove or directly under the beds, where there was at least a little warmth. Even meat, which the pioneers stored in the basement or outside, sometimes had to be defrosted by the fire before cooking. But it was even harder for the animals. For livestock, the water problem became a real disaster. Water troughs outside froze within minutes of being filled with water. Ice formed not only on the surface but also around the edges, turning the troughs into blocks of ice. Farmers had to go out into the cold several times a day, armed with an axe or crowbar, to break the ice and free the drinking troughs. It was a job that required strength, patience, and perseverance. Cows and horses, deprived of water, suffered from thirst despite the abundance of snow around them. Yes, it was possible to melt the snow, but the animals could not drink icy slush. It led to illness and inflammation. Therefore, people had to provide them with liquid water. Even chickens, if left without access to water, stopped laying eggs. Thus, the water problem affected the entire farming system, from people to the smallest domestic animals. The very process of delivering water to the house was a separate challenge. The well could freeze over, and then it was necessary to break the ice with a crowbar to get to the liquid. Sometimes the water at the bottom remained warm, but the bucket that was lifted into the frost immediately became covered with frost, and the handle burned the hands like hot iron. While a person was carrying buckets to the house, some of the water inevitably spilled and immediately froze on the snow, turning the path into a dangerous skating rink. People knew every bump and every footprint on this path, because the slightest mistake could result in a fall and a broken bucket, a loss that was difficult to replace in winter. To make their lives a little easier, the settlers resorted to tricks. Some hung their buckets on hooks near the stove to keep them warm. Others used clay or wooden vessels, which froze more slowly. We can see that survival on the American frontier was not only a struggle against lawlessness, but also a daily persistent battle with the climate. When the firewood ran out, the true spirit of the pioneer came to the fore. From collecting bison chips to building complex brick ovens, from using the geothermal heat of dugouts to ingeniously simple stone accumulators, each family became a laboratory for survival. This story is not about conquering nature, but about the incredible ability of humans to adapt. The settlers learned to use what they had in abundance, land, grass, and wind, to compensate for what they lacked. They proved that ingenuity and hard work can overcome even the most bitter cold. What other topics from the history of the American frontier or the lives of pioneers would you like us to cover? Perhaps you are interested in how they obtained water in the desert or built their first homes? Suggest topics for future videos in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories about survival in the Wild West.